Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa barakan bin Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. So, Jazakumullah khairan. Thank you all for being here, especially with the time change and moving back closer to the end of the workday. So, Jazakumullah khairan for making it, despite, I'm sure, what we all faced of challenges. So, last week we started a section of the book which is about 4 chapters, in which the Imam Al-Mujaddid rahimahullah ta'ala, he presents some of the wasa'il al-musila ila shirk, some of the agents, some of the means, some of the pathways that lead to a shirk, some of the root causes of a shirk. And the reason for that is because he wants to let us know in a roundabout way or directly that as Muslims who are striving to be muwahhideen, Islamic monotheists, it's not sufficient for us just to avoid idolatrous beliefs, idolatrous statements, idolatrous actions, but we also have to avoid the things that can lead to those. And if we don't avoid the things that will lead to those, if we downplay them or dismiss them, then ultimately over time we'll fall into them, or the people who come after us will fall into them. And he mentions 4 different wasa'il. He mentions 4 different agents or root causes of a shirk. And he doesn't mention them as if to say they're the only ones we need to be watch out for, but he mentions them just so that they exist, that they are things that lead to a shirk, that shirk doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It just doesn't happen arbitrarily, but there are things that lead people to commit a shirk, lead people to lower their guard and become more vulnerable to a shirk. And so if we're aware of these, then we can avoid falling into a shirk. So he began, we started out with the chapter in which he said, Babu ma ja'a anna sababa kufri bani Adam wa tarkihim dinahum huwa al-ghuluwu fi as-salihin. That the cause for man's infidelity, the primary cause for man's infidelity and abandoning his religion, is excessive exaltation of righteous individuals. So basically, when people go overboard in venerating and admiring and exalting righteous people, and they continue to elevate them beyond their human status, pretty soon there's nothing left except to what? To consider them divine or on par with the divine, and therefore worthy of what the divine is worthy of, which is worship. And so he gave, Jazallah khair, he gave a few examples of this. And the heart actually of this particular chapter and the evidences that he provided is the hadith of Ibn Abbas, in which he commented on the verse from Surah Noah, Surah Nuh, the 71st chapter, verse number 23, in which he said, وَقَالُوا لَا تَذَرُنَّ آلِهَتَكُمْ وَلَا تَذَرُنَّ وَدًّا وَلَا سُوَاعًا وَلَا يَغُوثَ وَيَعُوقَ وَنَصْرًا. And they have said, you shall not leave, or do not leave your gods. Do not leave Wad, nor Suwa', nor Yaghuth, nor Ya'uq, nor Nasr. So these were idols that they worshipped. And he goes on, Ibn Abbas, to explain what the verse means. He says, these are the names of some righteous persons from Noah's people. When they passed away, Satan inspired their people to set up statues in their honor and set them in their gathering places, and to give these statues the names of those departed. They did this but did not worship them until these people passed away and knowledge of their origins were forgotten. Then they were worshipped. And so basically what Ibn Abbas is saying in explanation, and Ibn al-Qayyim follows it up and says, most of our predecessors have stated after the death of the righteous persons, these 4 individuals, they confined, meaning they stood in, they would stand for long periods of time in veneration and in reverence of these men. They would stand at their graves and just reflect upon them and reflect upon the things that they did. So that's what he meant. That's what he meant by they confined. Actually, the word in Arabic is al-ukuf, and it basically means that they stood there out of awe and veneration and respect. They would stand at their graves and made these statues, and after much time passed, they started worshiping them. So basically, what Ibn Abbas and Al-Qayyim are saying is that when these men died, and they all died suddenly, and they all died right around the same time. And they were people who were known to do certain righteous deeds. They were very pious people. They did righteous things. They took care of the people. They gave charity. They fed the poor, etc. and so on. So when they all died suddenly, Shaitan saw an opportunity to invent or to introduce the greatest sin to the people of the earth. Because up to this time, they had done some things. They had committed sins. They had murdered, or there was murder. Murder had been committed. And some egregious crimes had been committed in those first 10 generations between Adam and Noah. But they hadn't. The one thing they hadn't done was the greatest crime, the greatest sin, which was a shirk. And the Shaitan saw the opportunity to introduce this great sin, because what is his end game? His end game is to get us to commit the ultimate sin, which will deny us, totally deprive us of an opportunity for salvation. So he saw this as an opportunity. So he came to the people in the form of a man, and he said, you guys are sad. You're full of grief for the loss of these great men. And you need to console yourselves. How can you console yourselves? You should build statues and put them in the town square, the town center. And these statues would be, representative of these men. And when you go past the town center and the place where they used to gather, you'll reflect upon the good things that they did, and you'll do good deeds like them, right? He didn't tell them immediately to worship these men or worship these statues, but rather he said, what? I can be patient. I can play the long game. So let me just get them to erect the statues. So they did that. And their intention was what? Their intention was good. And their intention was to worship who? Allah. That we're going to do good deeds like they did. We're going to be reminded of the good deeds they did, the charity they gave, the feeding of the poor that they did. And we're going to do the same things that they did. So some time passed. Some generations passed. And the people who came after them, after those original people who erected the statues, they didn't really know why those statues were erected. They just knew the statues were there. And these were some great men from the past. So the Shaitan came again in the form of a man. And he said, do you know why your forebears built these statues? They used to worship them. What's wrong with you people? You guys have deviated from the religion of your forefathers. You need to go back to what? To worship these statues, so they worship them. And so this is really the heart of that chapter, because it shows how from the veneration and over-exalting of these men, it ultimately led to what? To a shirk, right? It's the heart of he mentions other texts, but that really is the heart. It's the one that's the most direct line, the most straight line between the tarjuma, the title of the chapter, and the proof for the point that he's trying to make. That basically, look, we have to be careful, because when you start over-admiring people, what it ultimately leads to, or what it can ultimately lead to, is a shirk. And so last week we were commenting on some of the benefits from that particular athar and from the chapter as a whole. And so I wanted to kind of go through those before we went on. And Maghrib is what, 7:40 today? 7:40? Yeah. All right, so we'll go for another 20, and then we'll stop, and we'll offer time for discussion. And 7:36. Okay, so can we do an alarm for 7:05? How's that sound? All right. So what I wanted to do before we get into the other chapters is I wanted to complete our discussion on the previous chapter, specifically some of the benefits from that particular athar of Ibn Abbas explaining the ayah from Surah Nuh. So one of the things that the Imam mentioned last week, and we talked about this a little bit last week, was he mentioned that one of the things that we see from this athar is the peculiarity of true Islam. How true Islam, it stands apart and separate, and it sticks out like a green thumb. It seems odd when you compare it with the misinterpreted forms of Islam that we see nowadays. And when you compare it with what? With other faiths and other religions. That's general, because the Prophet told us, إِنَّ الْإِسْلَامَ بَدَأَ غَرِيبًا وَسَيَعُودُ غَرِيبًا كَمَا بَدَأَ. He said that Islam began as something strange, odd, something that just wasn't, it was unorthodox when you consider what were the societal and religious norms of the time, right? وَسَيَعُودُ غَرِيبًا كَمَا بَدَأَ. And it will return to being what? Strange and odd, something that sticks out like a sore thumb. It's just not what people are accustomed to. Why it comes to. So this statement of the Imam is true generally, but it's specifically true as it relates to what? Al-ghulu fi salihin. Excessive admiration and praise of the apparently righteous people. Tafadhal, Shaykh.
Just real quick, when you keep referring to the Imam, you're talking about?
Yeah, the Imam, Al-Mujaddid, Muhammad al-Wahhab. So, excuse me. So the Imam, he's talking generally, Islam is just different. True Islam is different. It looks strange, right? When people do certain things that are from the Sunnah and from the way Islam was practiced during the time of the Prophet, it looks strange. But particularly, Islam, true Islam, stands apart from other representations of Islam, less than true representations of Islam, as well as the other religions, as it relates to what? As it relates to admiration and excessive veneration of people. And we talked about this. So, for example, you have those who they go overboard in venerating the righteous people. And so they will say, for example, that such and such person is the most knowledgeable person who ever lived, right? He's the most saintly person that ever lived, the most pious person. He's sinless. And so this is what? Excessive praise of the righteous people. There's no one who's sinless, right? And there's no way to know if a person is the most knowledgeable person who ever lived. And in many cases, when we really, really take a step back and we're objective, we say, no, that person isn't as knowledgeable as, for example, Ibn Taymiyyah or Ibn al-Qayyim or. And certainly he's not as knowledgeable as Allah's prophets and messengers, who were the most knowledgeable people who ever lived, right? So this is what? Excessive praise of what? Of righteous people. Then sometimes we see that there are certain people who they present themselves as scholarly. They present themselves as academes. They present themselves as people who should be listened to and have a right to speak on Islam with some level of authority or credibility. They make themselves authorities on Islam. But in reality, they're not so. And people will do what? Again, they will elevate them and give them more credit than they deserve. And so you'll see, for example, people who say very questionable things, who have hundreds of thousands of followers on Twitter and on Instagram and on Facebook and on YouTube, etc. And so you see this, admiration, exaltation, and people, again, giving them certain, credit and certain credibility that they're not entitled to. We also see, and we gave this example as well, how people who are not even righteous, in fact, they are some of the most wicked, the most corrupt people. Even them, they're elevated. And we gave the example of Trump and how no matter what he does, no matter what he says, no matter how many lies he gets caught into, no matter how many criminal charges are leveled against him, he continues to be what? To be elevated and praised. And we talked about how there was a conference where there were actually statues of him that were being sold. And so Islam, the true Islam, is distinct from these less than true representations of Islam and these other false religions, in the sense that we don't go overboard in admiring anyone, right? And we keep people, as they say, nazilu nas manazilahum. We never, if a person deserves credit for something, we never deny them that credit. But what we never do is what? We never go overboard and give people more than what they're entitled to. And if they're not entitled to praise, we don't praise them to curry favor with them. You guys see that? طيب. So that was one point that the Shaykh or the Imam made, rahimahullah ta'ala, coming from this athar. The next one that he mentioned was that falsehood is seldom accepted except when it is mixed with truth. And the example that we find in this athar is that the truth was mahabbat as-Salihin. They loved those righteous men. They loved them and they admired them. And this is truth. This is from Islam. But what they did with that, they mixed some falsehood with that. And that mixing of falsehood with truth is what makes that falsehood palatable. Makes it something to be swallowed and accepted. And what the falsehood that they mixed with it was what? That excessive veneration that caused them to build statues and to stand at their graves, etc., and so on. Right? Stand at their graves in humility, etc. And so that's the falsehood that got mixed with it. And so basically what the Imam is telling us is to beware of this mixing of truth and falsehood, which starts to cause us to blur the lines of distinction between truth and falsehood, and to accept falsehood because it has now been mixed. You have to accept falsehood because it has now been mixed with truth, and that makes it more palatable. And we gave the example last time of how we ourselves put ourselves in positions where we're religious people and we want to follow the religion. We want to do the good things. We're not the people who, when we're told something is wrong, are going to say, well, I don't care if it's right or wrong. I want to do it and I'm going to do it. We're the people who we want to do the right things. And when we hear that something's wrong, we feel guilty. But people who are like that then get divided into two categories. And one of them are the people who that will take truth and begin to do what? Mix it with falsehood to make that falsehood more what? More palatable, more acceptable, to make excuses for themselves. And we gave the example, for example, a person says a man has to take care of his family, right? And a man has to do what he has to do to take care of his family. And that's truth. That is truth. That first part is true. And there's a number of evidence, there's much evidence to support that. So for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Ar-rijalu qawwamun 'ala an-nisa." He says, men are the protectors and maintainers of women. They're the protectors and maintainers of their women folk. And he says, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Prophet said in the hadith, he said, "Kullukum ra'in wa kullukum mas'oolun 'an ra'iyati." All of you are shepherds and each one of you is responsible for your flock. And part of that responsibility is what? The financial responsibility. And we have the hadith where the Prophet said, "Ibda bi nafsik thumma man ta'ul." He said, begin with yourself and then those who are under your charge, meaning that you have to provide for yourself first and then provide for those who are under your charge. And so there's lots of evidence to show that we're financially responsible for our women folk and for our children, etc., and so on. So that part is true. But then the second half of it is a man has to take care of his family. So if I have to open a gas station and I have to sell lotto and beer and wine and scratch-offs, right? Then I have to do what I have to do because a man has to take care of his family. So now the first part is true. A man has to take care of his family, but is it okay to sell alcohol? Is it okay to sell lotto? It's not okay. And so what we can't do is we can't take this truth and mix it with falsehood to make what? The falsehood more palatable. And this is what happens many times when we want to do the right thing. But we're put in a situation where we feel so desperate that we need to do what? We need to bend the rules. But we don't want to be the people who say, I'm just not going to do the right thing. I don't care what the right thing is. No, we're going to be the people who do what? Some of us will be the people who do what? Bend the truth, mix truth with falsehood to make the falsehood more palatable. We have to avoid that. And that's what they did. That's what they ultimately did. And so basically he's pointing out that we need to avoid that. Another thing that he mentioned or he alluded to is that one of the greatest destroyers of religion is the missteps or the indiscretions of learned people. One of the greatest things that causes people to go astray is when people who are learned and they're respected for their knowledge, when those people make mistakes, other people tend to do what? Follow suit. How many times have you been in a situation where you try to give someone nasiha and you said, hey, akhi, I don't think you're supposed to put your hands like that in prayer. Hey, akhi, I don't think you can say something like that. In fact, I remember reading a hadith where the Prophet said we can't say those words. Those words are words which are shirki. Or I don't think you can wear that. You can't dress like that. For example, that particular color, the Prophet prohibited wearing that color. And the person will respond when you give them that nasiha, they'll say, well, Sheikh so-and-so did this. Sheikh so-and-so said such and such. Sheikh so-and-so didn't disapprove of it. He saw me wearing it. People will use the learned people and their silence, right? Or their tacit approvals as an indication. Or even sometimes their explicit statements, which are not in keeping with what? With the text, with the nusus, with the proofs and evidences. They'll use it as a proof that what they're doing is right. And so this is part of what the Sheikh means when he says that one of the things that destroys the religion, or one of the primary things that destroys religion and causes people to go astray, is the missteps, the mistakes of the learned people. And so what we see nowadays, so for example, and there's lots of statements from the early Muslims where they have echoed this sentiment. So for example, there's a statement from Umar in which he said, "Thalathun yahdimna ad-din." He said there are three things which destroy the religion. And one of them, he said, zallatu alam, is the mistake, the misstep, the error of the scholar. And Ibn Abdul Barr, he has a book called Jami' Bayan al-Ilm wa Fadlih. And in that book, he mentions, he says, zallatu alam, zallatu alam. He says the mistake of the scholar is the mistake of what? Of nations, right? It's this mistake of what? Of nations of people. Because when a scholar makes a mistake, people will look at his knowledge and assume that because he's knowledgeable, what he did must be what? Right. Must be right. And they will do it. And even when they're shown, hey, that scholar is human and he made a mistake, people will ignore the proof and follow the scholar, right? So this is one of the things that makes it very difficult, very dangerous. And we see nowadays, we see this, playing out. So for example, in two ways. We see it playing out in two ways. So one of the ways is that when a scholar may err, or a scholarly person, or a learned person may err in their religious opinions, you'll see people defending their indefensible errors. And so, for example, let's say a scholar went and did something publicly, and what he did in public was something which is wrong, something which goes against the religion. And so let's say, for example, there's a video all over social media where this scholar went to a particular place and was with certain people, and he was doing and saying certain things which are disapproved by Islam. And so some concerned Muslims will look at that and they will see people who are, liking the video, right? Saying mashallah to the video. And they become concerned that these people don't realize that what this imam or what this scholarly person is doing is wrong. So they will, because they're concerned Muslims and concerned about their brothers and sisters in Islam, they'll say, hey, this behavior from the imam or this statement from the imam was wrong because Allah says, because His messenger says. And so they'll turn the people towards what? Right, toward the foundations of our religion. It's not men. Our religion is not founded upon men and what men do. It's based upon what Allah said and His messenger says. Is that right? And men can be in line with that, and they can deviate from that. And sometimes when they deviate from that, they might deviate inadvertently, accidentally, right? Due to no fault of their own. But when they deviate from that, our responsibility is to follow the Quran and Sunnah and not follow those people, not praise them for their errors, etc. So when these concerned Muslims will say this and say Allah said and His messenger said, you'll find though people coming back and attacking them, attacking their critics, the critics of these imams, and accuse them of having like ulterior motives. So they may accuse them of jealousy. They may accuse them of being agents, government agents. They may accuse them of all sorts of things, unfounded accusations, right, which go against our religion, which says, ijtanibu kathiran min adh-dhann inna ba'd adh-dhanni itham, avoid a great deal of suspicion, which means anything you can't substantiate, you're supposed to avoid it, right? Inna ba'd adh-dhanni itham, some suspicion is sin, but they'll do it in defense of what? Of the imam, in defense of the imam. And it doesn't matter if what he did is erroneous. He's a good person in our view, and so therefore we're going to defend what he did tooth and nail, even if it goes against Quran and Sunnah. Again, this type of behavior goes back to what we talked about earlier, about what? Elevating people above their station. He's human. He can make a mistake. If he makes a mistake, We acknowledge it's a mistake and we don't follow his mistake and we don't defend his mistake, okay? The other thing people might do is, for example, they'll insist that the person, the person made an error, but he had good intentions. He had good intentions. And that's what you hear all the time. Person had good intentions. Person had good intentions. Alhamdulillah. First of all, a person's intentions do we know them or do we not know them? That's unknown. So you might be right, you might be wrong because nobody knows. Allah knows, right? The second thing is that even if you have good intentions, it doesn't justify what? The behavior. Good intentions don't justify the behavior. We can't use good intentions as a justification for someone's behavior. Good intentions is one thing, the behavior is something else. Somebody goes to a rich neighborhood and they steal the neighborhood blind, right? They go into houses and they sneak in at night and they steal jewelry and they steal expensive silverware, etc. And then they go and they sell these goods and they give the proceeds to the poor, right? And they say, I just want to take care of the poor people. That was my intention, right? I just want to take care of the poor people, right? So they had good intentions. So now does that now justify their behavior? Can we say, oh, well, he had good intentions? So no, stealing is wrong. And stealing with a good intention will not make it right. Like Mumtaz. But the second thing that we see people doing in this area is if a scholar were to err in their behavior, then they'll try to do something even worse. They'll try to justify, legalize, or downplay the seriousness of the transgression. So you have some people, imams or people who are in these positions of scholarship, who have been accused of being human predators. Okay? They've been accused of very, heinous and egregious crimes. And when they're accused of these things, you'll have people who will come and defend them by basically justifying and legalizing, normalizing their behavior. And so basically, what are they doing? They're saying, this is the Islamic moral standard. This is what the Imam did. So they'll do what? Lower the Islamic moral standard to be in line with what the Imam did. The criterion for right and wrong is no longer what Allah said and His Messenger said. It's what the Imam did. And so, if he did it, then, it must be okay to do that, right? Or there must be circumstances that allow the behavior. You normalize the behavior. And we totally change and alter our view of right and wrong to be in line with what? With what that Imam did. And so these are some of the ways in which we see practically what the Imam is saying. How the religion of people can be destroyed by the missteps of what? Of scholars, especially if we don't avoid the first thing that he said, which is over what? Over praising and venerating and admiring righteous people. That basically we keep righteous people on the level that befits them. And when we do that, when they make a mistake, then they're human. We understand they're human and they made a mistake. We can acknowledge that they made a mistake. But when you raise them to a level where you think they're beyond human, it's hard to reconcile a person who's what? Almost on the level of the angels. He couldn't do something wrong. He couldn't be mistaken. So now I have to what? I have to find another explanation. Oh, he had good intentions. Oh, I didn't see what I thought I saw. Oh, maybe I thought the moral standard was here, but actually it's down here. I thought this was wrong, but actually it's what? It's right. Or it's just makruh. You guys see that? And so this one is very important that the Imam brought. But another thing that the Imam mentioned as far as the commentary on that athar of Ibn Abbas is he mentioned that innovation is more beloved to Satan than any other sin and is a stepping stone to disbelief, a stepping stone to shirk, a stepping stone to disbelief. And you see that in the athar that when the men first died, they didn't immediately start worshiping them. And the shaitan didn't immediately come and say, hey, you guys should go ahead and worship them. They were so righteous. Rather, what he said was, he said, build these statues, venerate them, stand in humility at their graves, right? And all of these things that they did were what? Were bid'ah. All of them were innovations. So the building of statues was what? An innovation. the standing humbly at their graves was an innovation. You guys see that? So he said, I can start them out on the path of shirk by what? By getting them to a what? Al-bid'ah. And this is important because a lot of times, is it time up? Really? Wow. Okay. All right. So there's a couple. I'm going to do the last ones real quickly, and then we'll open for discussion. So we see that nowadays we're in this constant tug of war where we have people who are saying, "Hey, we need to be careful about doing things religiously, which are unfounded, which are baseless." And you can call those people, I think the expression that we used last time was bid'ah phobes, right? The people who are just afraid of bid'ah. We have to just stay away from bid'ah. Anything that there's no basis for, we just stay away from it totally. And those people are pariahs in the Muslim community. They're outcasts. People just think that they're just extremists. They go overboard. They're making too big of a deal about these small things. But we see that this small thing, just standing there, venerating these great men, admiring them for the great things they did, and humbly standing at their graves, reflecting upon what they did to get closer to Allah, and then building statues to remind us of them so we do more good deeds. These innovations ultimately led to what? To a shirk. And so if we put that in the forefront of our minds, we can see why, we need to avoid what we consider to be small things, because it can lead down the road to big things. And it may not happen to us, but it may happen to what? To our kids. You guys see that? And so, we should be afraid. We have to be afraid, and we have enough evidence, enough examples, historically, this being one of them, that innovation can lead to what? To very major transgressions, the greatest transgression, which is a shirk. Then if you notice one last thing, if you notice in the Athar, he said, how did he put it? He said, حتى إذا هلك أولئك ونسي العلم عبدت. He said, once that generation of people who built the statues and knew why the statues were built passed away, another generation came and knowledge was forgotten. Ubidat. Those statues were worshipped. Those people worshiped those statues. And he says that shows the importance of knowledge. That the best weapon we have against falling into a shirk and following the wasa'il, following these pathways that lead to a shirk, is knowledge, learning our deen, which is why we're doing what we're doing. And so we generally speaking in communities throughout the world, there's this general indifference to at-Tawheed, the study of monotheism. And it's just felt like this is something ingrained in us as Muslims. We believe in the oneness of God, and so therefore it's not something that requires a great deal of study or review or revisiting. But we also see that there's a great deal of what? Deviation from at-Tawheed. And in Muslim countries, there are shrines that are visited. There are people who are called upon and asked for people's needs, right? There are places where people go and slaughter. So there's a commission of acts of idolatry in the Muslim community. And so when this is happening, what does that tell you? It tells you we do need this knowledge. We do need to learn, because either nusi al-ilm, once knowledge is forgotten, that's when what? When shirk comes. What protects you from committing a shirk? Knowing what? Knowing these wasa'il, knowing the things that are shirk, knowing the things that can lead to shirk, etc. and so on. So with that, we'll close and open for any questions or discussion. هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبي محمد. تفضل رفيق.
I wanted to reflect on what you were saying when it came to idolizing certain people. Mm-hmm. And I know I can't speak for everybody, but I came to the Nation of Islam. Mm-hmm. And after certain Islam took over because his father passed away, people started really idolizing that particular person. Mm-hmm. And we used to put out a paper in the community every week. Mm-hmm. And I would read the articles that he put in, and one of them I disagreed with. Mm-hmm. And I spoke to the assistant imam in the masjid and told him, I said, this ain't right. And right off away, he went, oh.
Yeah.
What do you know?
Subhanallah.
Compared to who I'm talking about.
Yeah, yeah.
What do you know? Who are you?
Mm-hmm.
I said, brother, it ain't right, really. And we got back and forth, until finally we parted. The next week he came back and apologized.
Really?
Came back and apologized, but he said the man retracted that statement.
Wow. Alhamdulillah.
Mistake.
Yeah.
And he got on his editors who's supposed to edit before he put words out in the public. All that stuff supposed to be edited.
Mm-hmm.
And then he got on the editor because he didn't edit. He let
Okay.
him go in because what he said was gold, right?
Yeah.
You know, so the brother here apologized. I said, alhamdulillah, but it just showed me at that particular time, this particular person, we all love him, but he's capable of making mistakes.
Eh.
He's one of many people who can make mistakes.
Yeah, even
You have a habit of using your mouth all the time as a weapon. Sometimes you can misfire, make a mistake with your mouth, with your knowledge, please. And this is something, like you said, we have to be careful of.
Jazakallah khair. I'll make two comments on what you just said. Jazakallah khair. First of all, his dad. There was a big issue with his dad, as far as it relates to that, in the sense that when there were certain accusations that were made against him by Malcolm X, and Malcolm X, had evidence. He had evidence. He had the actual women who were involved, and their children, etc. He was basically ostracized. He became a public enemy number one as it related to that particular movement. And they just refused to believe that he could be in error, totally blinded by what? By, like you said, the idolizing of this figure. And then as it relates to that particular movement, the movement of his son, I remember when I first became Muslim, that was my first exposure came from. And I remember the leader of that particular little mosque that I would attend, he wore like a lot of gold. He wore gold rings, he wore gold bracelet, etc. And at that time, we started like reading a hadith. And of course, we came across those hadith which talk about the forbiddance of men wearing gold. And when it was brought to this imam's attention, he referred to the gentleman that you're referring to and said that he approved it. He said it's allowed. There's nothing wrong with it. And I'm like, okay, but this is what the Prophet is saying. And he totally dismissed it because, like you said, when this person said something, they considered it almost as if he were a prophet. And what he said abrogated what the Prophet ﷺ said. And so you can see how venerating and elevating certain individuals can lead to a type of, shirk or something which at least what? It hinges, right? It's on the precipice of what? Of a shirk. Yeah, subhanallah.
And the same brother Malcolm really got upset when he heard about a sister being put out the masjid for bearing a child, and she's not bringing forth who the father is. And he came out with it, and the man of the whole community said that's what got him killed.
A'udhu billah.
When he opened his mouth and related, that he was guilty of this, Elijah Muhammad was guilty of this here, and he was against him. And his son, who had assumed the community, say he already knew, but he never spoke on it.
Allah
What
understand.
Malcolm did, everybody said, like you said, traitor.
Yeah, he was public enemy number
The
one.
word out, they hit him, they got him.
Subhanallah. Nasallah salam wa afiyah. And nasallah lahu al-maghfir wa rahmah.
I don't know, this might be fable about Robin Hood. He was the same type of person, rob from the rich
And give to the poor. Yeah.
So the poor loved him. They hated him.
Subhanallah.
I don't know whether that's true or not.
تفضل حبيب.
I just want to know how this relates to, or if it relates to, like when people visit the Prophet, peace be upon his grave in Medina.
اللهم صل على
When
محمد.
they go to the Balqi, You know what I'm saying? And just stand there. And even when you go, you have people who work there who basically telling you who's buried here and who's buried. It's like a whole guided tour of
Right.
information and whatnot. The big graveyard in Medina where like the Sahaba and whatnot, a lot of them are buried. Over where the mountain is.
Hey.
Uhud. Where Mount Uhud is. Yeah, at the bottom.
Hey.
So how does this relate to that, or does it? Or is there any significant difference? Because it sounds like it's kind of like the same thing.
Allah is
There's no statues being erected, but
Allah is akhir.
you go into the graveyard and just paying respects, I guess.
طيب, okay, so it's a very good question, Jazakallah khair. And the Imam, as I said, we're in a section where he mentions 4 chapters and 4 different wasa'il, 4 different pathways or agents or root causes of a shirk. The 4th one is over venerating or going above and beyond and venerating the grave of the Prophet ﷺ. So the first 3 are just general, about righteous people. And the last one is specifically about the most righteous of the righteous, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and his particular grave. And so the Prophet ﷺ, in that chapter, he mentions the hadith, the Imam, rahimahullah ta'ala, he mentions the chapter in which the Prophet said, "La taj'alu qabri 'eidan," right? He said, don't make my grave a place which is what? Which is frequently visited. Which is frequently visited. But at the same time, he taught us elsewhere that visiting the graves in general is what? Is mustahab. Visiting the graves in general is mustahab. And visiting his grave, according to the scholars, is what? Is mustahab. But it's not a place that you should do what? You should visit frequently. So basically what the scholars have said as far as the rules and regulations of visiting the Prophet's grave is that it's for al-ghuraba, it's for the people who don't live in Medina. So when they visit Medina, they are encouraged to what? To visit the Prophet's grave, right? Okay, they're encouraged to visit the Prophet's grave because it's mustahab, okay, it's a recommended or virtuous deed. And because visiting the graves in general is what? Is virtuous, right? So it's for al-ghuraba, but they're not going to do what? They're not going to violate the command of the Prophet. Don't make my grave an Eid, a place where you you visit frequently, because what? They're going to visit during that trip and go back to wherever they live. As for Ahl Medina, it's something that they should only do if they've what? If they've traveled out of Al-Medina and returned. Again, because what does that do? That avoids the Prophet's grave being a place which is what? Which is visited frequently. And what you see from that is the Prophet is trying to do what? To block the path that could ultimately lead to his grave being venerated to the extent that it becomes now a shrine. It becomes an idol, which is worship besides Allah. Okay?
Close to that point.
Right. So this is something that the Prophet ﷺ, put in place from his own words because he wants to avoid just that. And yes, you're right to say that there's no exception to the rule. It's not like, okay, the graves of these other righteous people, none of these things can be done there because we want to prevent the things that will lead to a shirk. But when it comes to the Prophet, you can do those things. No, the Prophet was very consistent that you don't worship Allah at the graves of the righteous people. He was also consistent that you don't what? You don't worship Allah at my grave. He was consistent in saying that we shouldn't over-venerate the righteous people generally. And he went on to say, "La tatruni kama atrat an-nasara Isa ibn Maryam." Don't over-venerate me like the Christians over-venerated Isa, right? So he was very consistent in saying that whatever I say about the righteous people generally applies to me as well, because he wants to avoid that. Now, what people do, just like they do with the righteous people, they'll go overboard and transgress with the Prophet ﷺ, but not due to any fault of his own, because again, he wanted to prevent that. So that's with respect to his grave. As far as Uhud and the people visiting and the tourism, visiting the graves is something which is what? generally, it's recommended. And so if people go and visit and give salams and they keep it moving, that's acceptable. But to spend a great deal of time in the graveyard, that's not something which is recommended. That should be done. And if the people do it, there's a difference between what people do and what's acceptable, what's right.
So what is this considered? Because you just said even going and standing at the graves, this is bid'ah.
At the very least,
So-
it's a bid'ah. At the very least, it's a bid'ah. If a person stands there in humility out of the place or the person, and they do that thinking that this is how you get close to Allah, with no basis for that, then that itself is a bid'ah. But now if they...
They visit out of love. I mean,
Eh.
knowing that the fact that this is where,
Eh.
Hamza, Umar, Khattab radiallahu anhu was buried next to Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad.
Out of love.
No, there's no harm if they go and visit, but
Like if I go on a tour and go and see the Uhud
Eh.
mountain, right? Because this is where Rasul sallallahu alaihi
Allahumma
wasallam
salli ala
was
Muhammad.
at one time. Some people trace the steps of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad.
You know, I don't see anything. Aisha radiallahu anha, she used to drink from, the same place, and Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam used to drink from the same place where Aisha drank, right?
What do you mean? Like his cup, his vessel is what you're talking about? Is that when you say you drink from the same? Okay, there's a difference between what they call the effects of the Prophet ﷺ. So, for example, a cup that he drank from, a bowl that he ate from, right? A utensil that he used, a thobe, a
Place that he went in.
thobe. No, the places are different. So, a thobe that he wore, these things that touched his person or that he touched, and they remain. Those types of things, there's no question they have barakah. And we talked about that. But the places where the Prophet went, and the places, for example, where he may have stopped without targeting that place as a place to stop and rest, or to stop and offer prayer, or stop and use the restroom. The Sahaba, their approach to those things was very different than their approach to what? To those physical effects, like a thobe or a bowl or a cup, etc. So it actually happened that Umar, he was on a journey with some people, and he stopped for rest, and there were certain people going to a certain tree. They were going to a certain tree, and Umar asked, why they're going to that tree? They said because the Prophet ﷺ went to that tree and he slept on that tree, or he prayed at that tree, something like that. And when Umar heard this, he had the tree cut down, right? So you can see that they differentiated between the places versus the actual physical effects. And so that's one thing. And so we don't have any evidence that they venerated the places, like you said, where the Prophet. But there's no harm. I think there's a difference between, you have to distinguish between, we go on a tour to see Mount Uhud and to become familiar with the history and to see the history, right? To see the place where this battle took place, right? There's no harm if we go and we see the place where some of these companions are buried, okay? But I think what Habib is talking about is very different. That they go and they stand humbly.
Yeah,
And now-
there's people that like, they say, okay, this is a dua you can say, like they'll say a dua out loud and like you can repeat it after them, and they're standing behind like the barricade, so they're giving you like history or whatever. So it's like, okay, if I'm gonna go to Medina, I gotta go to Uhud and gotta go see Baqi, and and they tell
Have
you
to
about-
know,
Well,
have
not
to know.
have to, but like it's like this is like a place circled on like things to do. And it's not just going and seeing, but like, I mean, when you go there and they say, okay, we'll say this dua, and you say something, bless them or whatever.
Now, what dua do they say? Is it the dua that we say when we go to the grave? Because that's, yeah.
I don't remember. I mean,
Yeah, so if most likely, because when I went to Medina, I didn't go to these places. I went with a specific, with a specific purpose, obviously, not to, but so I can't speak to that personally. But I would imagine that the dua that they're telling them to say is the dua that we say when we go to the graveyard. Assalamu alaikum, Assalamu alaikum. Say it louder. It's escaping me, Ahmed. Al-Lahiqun. Wa nahnu al-Lahiqun. But there's another one, I think. There's another one, I think.
So this isn't innovation.
No. I'm pretty sure that the dua that they're telling them to say is the dua that we're
I'm talking about just even if you don't say the dua, I'm talking about just going and reflecting at that graveyard.
No, because the Prophet said in the hadith collected by Muslim, he said, "Kuntu nahaytukum an ziyarat al-qubur, fal'an zuruha." Right? He said, I used to prohibit you, I prohibited you from visiting the graves, now visit them. And the scholars of Islam, they said that there are two reasons why the Muslims are encouraged to visit the graves. One is to be reminded of death and the hereafter. So there's a benefit in that, to be reminded of death and the hereafter. And the more we remind ourselves of death and the hereafter, the more our behavior, the more our actions in this world will be focused. We won't lose focus of what? Of our ultimate goal, which is to be successful in the hereafter. And so there's a benefit in that. And the second one is to make dua for the deceased, to make dua for the deceased in the grave, right? And so I think the dua that they're teaching is the dua that we say when we visit the grave. So there's no harm in that. The harm would come, like you said, if a person went and just stood humbly for an extended period of time at the grave of a deceased person. And they did that either because this person is what? They're particularly righteous, they're particularly special. Venerating them is somehow a way to draw closer to what? To Allah. You see that? There's a difference between that and going, for example, and sitting at the grave. Let's say, for example, a person went to the grave of their loved one. And they went and they wept. They made dua for their relative. They told their relative how much they loved them. And yes, you can speak. We talked about this before. You can speak to the deceased in the grave, right? And the scholars of Islam say that they can what? They can hear you, right? Tell them how much you love them, how much you miss them. You don't ask them for anything. That's where the prohibition comes, right? You don't ask them for anything. Tell them how much you love them and you miss them. And you spend time there, what? Reflecting on what they meant to you, and you leave. At no point is there, this person is somehow particularly special with Allah, and therefore sitting at their grave earns me some type of what? Some type of reward. That's the difference between what we saw from the people of Noah when they stood at the graves of those righteous men and what we're talking about right now. So visiting the graves again, it's something which is mustahab because of the hadith of the Prophet in Muslim. Visiting the grave of the Prophet particularly, mustahab for the people who what? Visit Al-Madinah, provide that what? It's not repeated, it's not done repeatedly, because what is that? That ultimately leads to what? To a shirk, to his grave being over-venerated, and the fear of that is that it will become what? Shirk. As Aisha, she said that's one of the reasons why the Prophet's grave was not put in the what? In the open, right? Because of the fear that what? People would ultimately worship his grave. That's why it wasn't put in the open. تفضل جبريل.
There's no rule against women visiting the grave.
There's a difference of opinion amongst the scholars about that, and it's a pretty good debate on it. And the evidence for those who say it's prohibited is strong. Those who say it's allowed is also strong. They have some pretty good counter evidences. One of them is that Aisha radiallahu anha, she visited the grave of her brother, and there was no inkar, there was no disapproval from the other companions. That's one of the evidence they give that women can, in fact, visit the graves. But the scholars of Islam will say this is significant because it's one of those debates that I myself kind of have gone back and forth on. But the scholars of Islam are agreed that it's not mustahab for a woman to visit the graves. They're agreed. But it is mustahab for what? For men. And the proof that the people who say it's okay for women, because there's a hadith where the Prophet He said, لَعَنَ اللَّهُ زَوَّرَاتِ الْقُبُورِ, or زَائِرَاتِ الْقُبُورِ. He said Allah's curse is upon the women who visit the graves, right? So that's the strongest proof of the people who say it's prohibited for women to visit the graves. But not just prohibited, but it's a major sin, because the Prophet said, لَعَنَ Allah, right? Allah's curse be upon them, right? So that's one side. Now they come on the other side, they counter, and they say the Prophet said in the hadith, كُنْتُ نَهِيتُكُمْ عَنْ زِيَارَةِ الْقُبُورِ. Previously, I prohibited you from visiting the graves. فَالْآنْ زُرُوهَا, right? He said, but now visit them. So they say on this side of approval, yeah, you can visit them because the Prophet had prohibited, but now he allowed it. These people will say that was just for what? For men. These people say, no, it's more general. But what do you benefit from this hadith? You benefit that visiting the graves is what? Mustahab. It's mustahab. It's recommended now. He said, I prohibited you before. Now I'm ordering you to visit them. The scholars of Islam say if you have an order that follows a nahi, that follows a prohibition, it lands what? In the middle, which is what? Al-istihbab. It's recommended. If the Prophet orders us outright to do something, it makes it what? Wajib. Doesn't it? So what if he prohibited us and then after prohibiting, he orders us? They say it what? Instead of going to wajib, it lands what? In the middle. Al-mustahab, al-istihbab, right? It's recommended. So they say it's recommended from this hadith. But then the people on this side will say, yeah, well, there's ijma' that it's not recommended for what? For women. So that would seem to indicate that what? This hadith doesn't apply to what? To women, and strengthen the argument of the people who say no. So I say all that to say, Jibril, that what? It's not a simple yes or no. These people have very strong evidence on their side. These people have very strong evidence on their side.
But how
For
the men?
No, he didn't.
So la'na is a big word.
And there's no question. I'm right there with you. And that's what
Makes it haram.
the people who prohibit it, that's their strongest evidence. These people on this side will say those hadith are questionable. It's a very detailed debate, Ahmed.
I never actually knew that there's debate about it.
Yeah, so this one, depending on your madhab. Because like in the Saudiya, it's la'an Allahu.
Yeah.
Right, that's it. That's all they say, right? But yeah, when you look into it more deeply, then you see that there's the people this side is pretty strong, but you can see how these people counter, that's how it is. But this is one of those that it's not as cut and dry as some of the other issues. This one is, you can see the strength on both sides. You can see the strength on both sides,
I wonder if, and I don't want to sound ignorant, but if the initial prohibition was aligned with the Quran, and it don't sound right, but then the Prophet gave a green light for it. But initially, its prohibition would have been aligned with what Allah said. And I don't know, I guess there was, because I don't know. I don't know. I'm saying that maybe I don't even want to say maybe he. I'm saying that maybe the prohibition, I don't know. It's, I guess.
Well, yeah, so initially, I think when he initially prohibited it, it was for their protection. Because again, what typically has happened historically, and this is not just a Muslim thing, what has typically happened historically for people and graves is a level of veneration that crosses the line and enters into idolatry, right? So for their protection, especially people who were being trained now to no longer think idolatrously, right? To no longer behave idolatrously, no longer believe, act, say things which are idolatrous. Yeah, everything for them was what? It was just cut off. It was just cut off. Anything that could ultimately lead you to begin to think the way you used to think, behave the way you used to behave, act and believe the way you used to act and believe was prohibited. But then they were trained and they became strict monotheists, and they had understanding of, what it meant to worship Allah and avoiding these wasa'il. And then there are some issues where the benefit can outweigh the harm, especially for those who have a good level of understanding. And so the Prophet ﷺ, he saw the benefit. Again, we talked about, he saw the benefit of them going to the graves to remember death and to reflect upon the hereafter. And so he permitted it for that purpose. He permitted it for that purpose. And obviously the additional purpose of making dua for those who are deceased, making dua for those who are deceased. And so that's why Allah knows best, he allowed it toward the end of his mission and toward the end of his life. He permitted it. The question is now, does that exception encompass men and women, or is it something specific just to men? And the arguments, like I said, on both sides are pretty strong, yeah.
Yeah, I heard one brother tell me that the Prophet reprimanded women that were following the gravesite, and he spoke to them, where are you going? What are you going for? You're not going to do anything but get in the way. It's full of men, and it calls for mixing, you know. So he told them to go back. You know, you're not needed, and he didn't say you're not wanted, but you're not needed. The men are taking care of everything, putting the body in the grave, covering the grave up and whatnot, and you trying to peek down when they're putting the body in the niche, you know, but you got to be right up with the men to see this. You know, so he had told them to go back. Now, I don't know whether that was something that was actually said, that he said it, because I never read that hadith myself.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that hadith, but like I said, the people who prohibit, one of the wisdoms they say behind the prohibition is that women are generally more emotional than men and less capable of controlling their emotions. And one of the things that is prohibited is that we become so exceptionally emotional that we begin to say and do things which violate as-sabr, which violate the requirement to be patient. And there's an example in the life of the Prophet ﷺ, in the hadith of Anas, that the Prophet passed by a woman who was sitting at a grave. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. She was sitting at a grave and she was mourning the death of her son who had died in adolescence. You know, so he was somewhere between, he was young, very young. We're talking about 6, 7 years old, something like that, right? So she was mourning and bewailing his death and excessively mourning his death. And the Prophet ﷺ, he said, ittaqillaha wasbiri. He said, fear Allah and be patient, which lets you know that whatever she was doing was not in line with the taqwa, that she was transgressing the legal limits, and she was violating the requirement to be patient. So whatever she was doing and saying, and you know, women sometimes they do what? They tear at their clothes, they slap their cheeks, this excessive behavior. Or she may have even been saying something which was prohibited, like, you know, gone too soon. You know, this is not fair. It's not right. You know, I mean, something like that. Now, obviously, now this is now you're questioning Allah's decree. So the Prophet told her, ittaqillaha wasbiri. He told her, fear Allah and be patient. And so this is one example where a woman was at the gravesite and was what? Being excessive and exceeding the bounds and limits. And so this is one of the arguments of the people who say it's not permissible.
Kick her out. Excuse me.
Yeah, and that's a good point. That's a good point too. But somebody could say to counter that and say, when he said ittaqillaha wasbiri, when he said fear Allah and be patient, that was a roundabout way saying, yeah, you shouldn't be here. You know, that's a roundabout way. Ittaqillah, fear Allah, meaning, you know, follow the guidelines, stay within the guidelines. You shouldn't even be here, right? And you definitely shouldn't be behaving. So you could see it either way. Yeah, barakallahu feek. All right.
People would, especially women, would say, like you say, if a young person is rated, why? This is questioning Allah. You know, when you say why my child?
Right, exactly. And so, may Allah help us all. Jazakumullah khairan. هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.